Welcome back to the School of Muscle. Today I'm joined by Dr. Cas Fuchs. He is a scientist and teacher who focuses in the areas of muscle physiology, sports nutrition, and recovery strategies. Thanks for coming on.
Good to be here.
You've done some really cool work related to heating and cooling strategies post-exercise and how that kind of influences muscle protein synthesis. And the main audience for this podcast is probably going to be focused on how to best get jacked. So definitely interested in whether these strategies are helpful or maybe if they even harm post-exercise protein synthesis. So I think a good place for us to start here is, I know you've studied cold water immersion and assessed kind of shorter and longer term rates of muscle protein synthesis. So I'd be super interested if you could kind of discuss kind of why you wanted to kind of go into this study and then also what the methods were and kind of get into it from there.
Yeah, sure. So maybe first, the interest of how I got into that research topic is because I'm really interested in muscle physiology in general. And within muscle physiology, I focus a lot of my research on the effects of carbohydrates and protein metabolism. And obviously, protein metabolism, I think, is also for this podcast really interesting because I really want to know how we can recover properly, or like maybe accelerate our recovery or optimize our recovery. And also I focus a lot on the adaptation process. So how can we indeed build bigger muscles? And of course, in that adaptation process, the recovery process obviously is one of the most important aspects. So a lot of research that I've done is focused on recovery strategies. And if we look at some recovery strategies that are really often applied by many athletes, then one of the most popular ones is actually cooling. Now, cooling we can do in different ways, these cryo chambers, these cryo saunas, but also like what you often see is that many of these athletes, that goes from even like martial arts or football players, anything, they go into these ice buckets or like these ice baths after exercise to speed up their recovery. And what's interesting is that it has been performed by many athletes already for years. But like from a more purely physiological perspective, if you look at the muscle, we still don't know like relatively that much, especially if you see about all the claims that are being made about these strategies. So I really wanted to figure out at least one aspect of recovery and adaptation, which is muscle protein synthesis, which basically means that you make new proteins. So after exercise, for example, you kind of damage, your proteins. They need to be replaced. So you need to get new proteins into your muscles. So you have functional muscle again. And also eventually, if that's your goal, you can grow your muscle. So we wanted to know, how does cooling actually impact, and if it actually impacts that process. So what we did, we indeed run actually like a more acute as well as a longer term study where we measured muscle protein synthesis, and we can do this via like a lot of techniques. I'm not sure if I should go into too much detail here because it could become a bit scientific. But just in short, what we do, we kind of put an infusion line in participants, and those infusion line that goes for example, a whole day. And there, in that infusion line, there are labeled amino acids. So these amino acids are exactly the same amino acids we have in our own bodies. The only small difference is that they're slightly heavier. So if we then take blood samples as well, or if we take muscle biopsies from these people, so we take a small piece of muscle out of their legs, we can see how much of that specific amino acid, again, which is the same as what we have in our body, but just slightly heavier, that's the only difference. We can see how much is actually being incorporated into our muscles. So we can then basically calculate with some calculations how much is actually the rate of protein synthesis. And we can do that in rest, and we can also do that after intervention. So for example, what does it change if we give protein shake? Does it change if we do exercise? Does it change if we do any type of recovery strategy? And so we also wanted to see, does it change indeed? Does muscle protein synthesis change if you do post-exercise cold water immersion? So in an acute setting, what we did, and by the way, Ryan, if I go too fast or if it's not clear, just interrupt me.
No.
Otherwise, I'll keep going.
You're doing great.
So what we did, perfect. So what we did, we had young participants coming in the lab. So all were familiar with resistance exercise. And we let them perform resistance exercise. And after that, we actually put one of their legs in cold water. That was for 20 minutes at 8 degrees Celsius. And the other leg at 30 degrees Celsius, also for 20 minutes. I don't know if you use degrees Celsius over there, because I don't really know what the conversion would be to Fahrenheit, for example. But
looks like 8 degrees Celsius is 46 Fahrenheit.
So it's cold. Yeah, I did pilot myself as well. Of course, for most of my studies, I do it just to see if what's like feasible and how I experience it myself. But it's like pretty cool. But it's not necessarily. I mean, if you typically look into the literature and what people do in like real life, like athletes, for example, they also go between 5 to 20 minutes of water immersion, and then the temperature can range from 5 degrees Celsius to up to 20. But typically it's around, I would say, between 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, and also for 10 to 15 minutes. So with the 8 degrees and 20 minutes, we went a little bit on like the let's say the more extremes, but still within a practical range. So what practically has been done. And we did that because we wanted to see if there would be an effect at all. Because, for example, if we would not see any effect, and I will go into the results in a bit, but we thought before, if we don't see an effect with this, then we are pretty confident that cooling doesn't have an effect on muscle protein synthesis.
Right.
So that was basically the reason why we chose for this kind of cooling method. So what we then just did, so if I go back to the design, so the participants again did resistance exercise. We put one leg in cold water, one leg in thermoneutral water. So 30 degrees Celsius is basically kind of this temperature you would have roughly if you take a shower. So what feels comfortable. And then we also gave them a protein shake afterwards. And this was not just a random protein shake you buy in like the supermarket or that you order online. This was a specifically labeled protein shake. So we also had specific amino acid labels in that protein shake. So we could see exactly how much of the amino acids from the protein was being used and incorporated into our own muscles. So we could not only calculate muscle protein synthesis, but we could also say something about if cooling has an influence on the food that we eat subsequently. So that was quite cool. So what we then found, so we measured over 5 hours later, we took several muscle biopsies. So we could track over time what happens with the incorporation of these tracers of, again, these labeled amino acids from the infusion line and from the protein shake into our muscles. And now we could say something about protein synthesis if there was a difference between the leg that was not cooled and the leg that was cooled. And also if there was a difference in the amount of amino acids that are being incorporated from the protein shake. And what we found was interesting because indeed we figured out that the leg that was cooled indeed had a substantially lower muscle protein synthesis rate compared to the leg that was not cooled, so the thermoneutral leg. What we also found was that the protein shake, so the amino acids that come from the protein shake, were less incorporated into the leg that was cooled compared to the leg that was not cooled. So in other words, if you cool after resistance exercise, you actually kind of blunt your response or hamper your anabolic response that you actually would like to optimize after exercise to repair muscle damage, but also to grow your muscles over the long term. So we kind of nicely show that in like a single study, not only just from your body, but also from the protein shake itself. You kind of hamper or hinder that effect in some way. That was the acute study.
That's really cool. And I think that might kind of fly in the face of some of the strategies that people use on like a regular basis. I think, I know maybe less informed athletes would tend to just jump in an ice bath every day after practice or every day after lifting weights. And maybe there's application there over like just a short term, to peak performance or something, but in general training throughout an entire year, to me, it sounds like probably not something you want to do on a regular basis, or else you do get that kind of blunted adaptation response, which for our context will potentially or likely limit muscle hypertrophy. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I agree. I would still say, I mean, I don't want to say with our study that we should completely get rid of cold water immersion.
Yeah.
There may be a time and place for it still, but if we need focus on the hypertrophy, so becoming bigger, getting muscle mass, then that study definitely acutely shows it's not a smart idea to do. And in fact, we maybe to follow up a little bit, we also did a 2-week study because we also wanted to see what are the longer term effects as well. So we had the same participants also coming into the lab for 7 exercise sessions over 2 weeks. So that was a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Monday again. So 7 days over a 14-day period. And then again, we did the same exercise session and the same leg, again for the same temperature and duration, so 20 minutes, 8 degrees Celsius. We cooled repetitively after every session again. So we could also see, and this was with a different tracer approach, so we then give every day a bolus of what we call heavy water. So it's basically just drink a little bit of water, and the water in there is slightly heavier than the one that you get from the tap or that you buy in the supermarket. And there again, we can see by stuff that happens in the body, it gets converted into, or it gets used, that heavy water gets used to incorporate into a specific amino acid, alanine. And then we can see how much of that alanine that's labeled is being incorporated into your muscles. There again, we could see by taking biopsy before and after that 2-week period, what the difference is between a leg that is repeatedly cooled compared to a leg that is not cooled. And there again, we found that over 2 weeks, again, there was a substantial and a significant difference between the legs. So again, longer-term muscle protein synthesis rates, perfectly in line with our acute study, was lower in the leg that was cooled compared to the leg that was not cooled. If we then take it even a step further, this is not my research, but from some of my colleagues, they looked into even longer-term responses. So, for example, 7 weeks or 12 weeks even. In Australia, those studies have been performed. And there they also found that if you do repeated cooling and you look even at muscle mass with the gold standard technique that we have these days, which is MRI, then you also see lower gains in muscle mass if you do repeated cooling after resistance exercise compared to if you don't do it. So I think that kind of nicely, a lot of research always is okay, one research group finds this finding and the other cannot fully confirm it or finds contrasting findings. So we always try to figure out where is the answer or how do we can explain differential findings or contrasting findings. But this research, at least so far in this direction, seems to be relatively consistent that if your main goal is hypertrophy or getting gains in muscle mass and strength, then I think it's definitely not smart to always apply cooling after your exercise. And you should really think about what your goal is after exercise. If it's hypertrophy, I would not advise it.
I think that's perfect. Usually I go on to provide a little bit of a summary about what my guest just said, but I think that you did a very good job of putting all that in a very easy, understandable way. So yeah, that sounds great. And you also kind of went into one of my follow-up questions was going to be has any of the research changed here recently on this that has come out with evidence kind of maybe to the counter or anything like that? But to me, it sounds like it's been fairly consensus. Most research is kind of pointing in the similar direction of, hey, if maximizing muscle growth is a goal, you probably shouldn't do too much kind of cold water immersion post-exercise or very often when you're trying to maximize that.
Yeah, exactly. I agree. There is a relatively recent study that was that's maybe interesting. That was in season in rugby players and high-level rugby players. I think they did 4 weeks of cooling or actually hot water immersion as well in that study, or just nothing. And with DEXA scans, so it's not the most sensitive way to assess changes in muscle mass, but still it's an interesting way to say something about body composition. There they find in season, if they do some cooling, that they didn't really show negative effects of it, but also what they did not observe was any increase in general or any improvement in lean body mass as assessed with DEXA. So I think it's not to say if you're performing resistance exercise and you're a serious gym goer, and if you would do once cold water immersion that you will completely ruin your gains. That's obviously not the case. But definitely if you repeatedly do it, and your goal again is hypertrophy, then yeah, exactly as you say, it's quite consistent so far still I mean, we don't know in the future, but I can hardly believe that now all of a sudden 5 studies come out showing that it's beneficial. So yeah, I think so far, or well, based on the literature so far, it's pretty clear that for that goal, it's not smart to cool after exercise, after resistance exercise. It could be different for other types of exercises.
Yep, absolutely. And I think for my audience, mainly focused in physique development, I think that kind of gives them as much of a takeaway as they need right now. Literature probably doesn't support doing cold water immersion when their goal is physique development to kind of maximize that. So I think that kind of provides a good kind of summary of what you did in that study, as well as kind of the current evidence on cold water immersion and how it relates to muscle growth. So now I think it's good if we kind of transition into, you did another study on, instead of cold water immersion, did hot water immersion, and kind of looked at what were the post-exercise responses when doing hot water immersion. So could you maybe kind of give a rundown of a similar thing that you did for your cold water immersion on why you kind of wanted to do this and what you guys ended up doing?
Sounds much better, doesn't it, hot water immersion?
Yeah, it does.
At least I think going in, I was thinking that. I mean, going into a hot tub sounds quite more, chill than if you would go, more relaxed than if you would go in the cold tub.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so...
I was just gonna say, I'm a wuss. I can't even do like cold showers. I know like some people swear by it, but I've tried it once and I'm like, this is definitely not my thing.
Yeah, they're really popular now, the cold showers and also cold water immersion outside of the recovery spectrum, just for just general health and stuff. And so a lot of people are into it these days. It's kind of funny, especially here now. I'm not sure how it's there, but it's really cold outside, and people go into the river here and plunge themselves under for a while. It's interesting. But no, back to the hot tubs, which definitely sounds more better to me at least. We were indeed, after these results from the cold water immersion study, we were indeed thinking okay, so what cooling basically does in the muscle is it reduces your temperature. We also measured that by measuring muscle temperature. And it also kind of lowers the blood flow towards your muscle, and that you also see with what I said, when we gave the protein shake and we tracked the amino acids out of that protein shake and their incorporation into the muscle. We found this was also lowered in the leg that was cooled compared to the other leg. So that likely is for 2 reasons. So first of all, temperature is reduced, so enzyme activity in the muscle cells are lowered. And you, of course, want high enzyme activity because you want to speed up all the process to improve your recovery, to make sure that your damaged muscles are, again, repaired, etc. But you also want to have your optimal speed of building blocks. So again, those amino acids we consider as building blocks for your muscle, that they are transported and delivered in the muscle as soon as possible. So if you also lower that response, so you kind of lower the amount of, or if you lower the blood flow, so less of these building blocks actually reach the muscle in that sense, that's something you don't want. So, and also again, we found that with that cooling study. So we wanted to see what if we heat the muscle, because we thought maybe if we then heat up the muscle after exercise, it could give us the opposite effect. So you could potentially increase enzyme activity, so further allowing your muscles to repair themselves and to grow themselves again. And also we wanted to speed up the blood flow, essentially, at least if possible. So we were figuring out if that was even possible. So indeed, we did a similar study. We again had young participants coming into our lab. We again let them do resistance exercise. And then afterwards, we did one leg again in a thermoneutral water. So that was again 30 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. And the other leg we did in this case, 46 degrees Celsius for 20 minutes. I have to say that this is just one leg, 46 degrees Celsius. Again, I should look into the conversion to Fahrenheit. I don't know. But it's really warm. So it's kind of, I also pilot this myself. Yeah, I'm curious, what is it?
Right around 115 degrees Fahrenheit.
So have you tried that before?
No, definitely not. Well, I mean, what's the average temperature of a hot tub?
I think it goes max, I would say maybe 38 to 40 degrees Celsius, I would guess.
So this looks this quick Google search, so take that for what it's worth. It says the average temp of a hot tub is around 105 to 110 degrees. So that would, Celsius, let me get degrees to Celsius back up here. So that would be about 40 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I indeed expected.
Yeah.
So yeah, 46 is definitely not for your whole body feasible. So, but again, what we wanted to achieve is we wanted to know, okay, we want to make sure that the muscle is as warm as we can make it with hot water immersion. So again, I did the pilot. I was in there for 20 minutes, and 46 degrees is something that I could kind of handle. My leg afterwards was completely red, and I was sweating a lot. But yeah, that was still okay, and I think like much warmer was not even possible because you really burn your leg almost. So I was also about to say, like, this is not something you can do with your whole body. I think then that 40 degrees is already quite towards your max. But we did this study. So again, proof of concept, 20 minutes, 46 degrees Celsius, just to figure out if we would just maximize the temperature, if we could then increase muscle protein synthesis, which then potentially in the long term would be beneficial to get more gains in muscle mass. And I thought this was great because if it works, then it will be a nice excuse to go into like a nice warm bath after every time I went to the gym. So we did the study again. I also gave the protein shake, so we also wanted to know if the amino acids from that drink were actually being incorporated faster and maybe into a higher extent in the muscle that was heated compared to the non-heated leg. And what we found basically was no difference. So despite the nice theory and despite we thought, maybe this could actually be beneficial because it does the opposite than the cooling, we found the same response in terms of muscle protein synthesis in both legs, and we also found the same incorporation of the amino acids from the protein shake. So I think the good news from that study is it's not detrimental. So for those of people that really like to go into a hot tub or a warm bath or like kind of a sauna after their workouts, it will not be detrimental for muscle growth, at least not what we found in our study. But it also doesn't really help you, at least from a muscle physiology perspective in terms of recovery. Of course, recovery is very broad, or you can look into very different things. And if you relax, for example, in your whole body by doing a sauna, that could also have some benefits for recovery. But just purely from the perspective of growing your muscle bigger, there is no. We didn't see any beneficial effect there. And also a more longer term study, if I can keep going again a bit, Ryan.
Absolutely.
They also, this is also done actually in Australia. I think there was in collaboration with the Scandinavian group. This has not been published, by the way. I like the thesis of this person is online, so I saw the data, but it's not been published. So I assume it will still happen at some point. But they did like a longer term study. I think they did 10 weeks of resistance training. And then also after every session, they went into either hot water immersion, one group, or the other group didn't. And then also they did not see any further benefits of the hot water immersion group over the normal group in terms of gains in muscle mass or muscle strength. So again, also, that's kind of in line with our study. That there's not really a beneficial effect from muscle growth if you do hot water immersion after your exercise sessions.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, when you line it up kind of mechanistically, you kind of can create a little bit of a rationale there for why it might make sense if it was actually beneficial. But yeah, it sounds like the acute and both longitudinal studies on this don't really support it being beneficial. But like you said, also not potentially worse, and maybe indirectly, if it helps you relax more and it's just a nice way for you to kind of like wind down after lifting, maybe there could be some benefits there. Do you think I'm stretching that a little bit too much, or does that sound about right?
No, I think you're right. I think that's even for cooling, because I always talk to people ask me like often like, hey, about recovery strategies and what should I do and like what is about this high, blah, blah, blah. And it actually always comes down to, like, in my opinion, the two most important ones are actually nutrition and sleep. And even with cooling, I mean, some people tell me, and this is very anecdotal, by the way, but some people tell me that they sleep much better if they take a cold shower, or we just discussed a little bit, for example, right before going to bed. And I'm like, okay, if you really sleep better by a cold shower, then yeah, by all means do it, because sleeping is really important. And that's also what I'm trying to work on myself much more these days, because I know of the importance, but I always lack my sleep. And I think most people do that. Everyone that works a lot or is working on some goals or whatever, like sleep is so easily to say like, then I'll just work one more hour tonight and then I go to bed. But then it's always sleep that's like, at least for me, like the problem.
Yep.
Even though I know it's so important, because not only for like physiology, because we also know for muscle physiology is important, but also for like, even if you go to the gym and like if you didn't sleep well, you will feel it. You will know it. I think all the listeners have experienced this in the past. So yeah, so for sauna, the same thing. If you can relax well, and if you then go to bed and you sleep better, then definitely it will be beneficial. Even though it may not be directly, but it's indirectly, but it still will help you in the long term. And I think that same goes for spas or massages, all these kind of strategies. So you have to look into like the whole spectrum, I find, if you really want to optimize your recovery, and they can definitely, in another way, potentially play a beneficial role.
Yep, absolutely. And I like that you touched on nutrition and sleep as being kind of the biggest levers when it comes to your recovery, as well. As I've been coaching for several years now, and I would say the number one thing that clients don't have in place, usually my clients are pretty solid at their training. Usually they're good at like eating enough protein, getting nutrition in. But the one area to where it seems like everybody struggles a little bit is definitely that sleep. So, if incorporating like a warm bath or something into their nighttime routine helps them sleep better, I think that could totally be beneficial.
100%. Yeah. And I think, that should be the focus: sleep and nutrition, and the rest is all, marginal gains at best.
Yep, absolutely. And you did mention a little bit of other unpublished research. Has any other research come out on heating post-exercise that contradicts yours at all? Or would you say that generally there doesn't seem to be strong positive or negative effects to heating post-exercise?
Well, that's a good question. So yeah, it's also always interesting to keep in mind we have heating, and heating can be performed by different ways, different methods. So I did hot water immersion. The study I just touched upon also did hot water immersion, but you can also do heating via sauna. You can do heating via heat packs. Some athletes put heat packs on their legs to try to increase their or accelerate their recovery. So there's definitely not more to the story if we talk about heating than just the hot water immersion. If we look into some of that literature, that's definitely not like a clear-cut answer there. Like heating does this, or this specific heating strategy does that. But there are some data to suggest that potentially a sauna could be beneficial or detrimental for recovery. So sauna, for example, could elevate some anabolic signaling molecules. And that basically means is that those are if you increase those, then they could be beneficial to also increase muscle protein synthesis. It doesn't always line up in our research studies, but that's basically what happens. Also, that study that I'm referring to now was without any exercise, so it's still the question as a recovery strategy if it would be more beneficial. And if we look into that perspective specifically as well, I'm going into a little bit of a side direction right now, but one other aspect that I'm very interested in with muscle physiology is glycogen repletion. And glycogen is basically the energy store in our muscles that we use during exercise. And there was a study that did, or there was this research group actually from the States. They did like a study where they looked into glycogen recovery with a heat pack, but also one by going into like a hot chamber basically. And with the heat pack, very local on the leg, they found an acceleration of glycogen recovery in the muscle. But in the other study where they actually looked into the hot chamber, like the heat temperature chamber, they found that it was actually lowered. So basically, if people went into a warm chamber of, I think it was about 40 degrees Celsius roughly, they're actually they were not benefiting their glycogen repletion, but actually hampering it. So the question basically is how why is that? And we now think, at least also in that article, they discussed that it's potentially, for example, because of sweating. So if you're in a hot environment, you will sweat more. So more of the blood flow goes towards the skin instead of the muscle. So maybe potentially also less carbohydrates going to the muscle to be able to replenish that glycogen in your muscle. Whereas with the local hot pack, you don't really sweat because it's just very local. And then actually maybe locally you can increase blood flow and therefore giving more of these carbohydrates to the muscle to replenish your glycogen stores there. Because of course, I'm not sure if I said it, but glycogen is actually basically like a lot of glucose branches attached to each other stored in the muscles. It's basically carbohydrate storage in your muscle. Mm-hmm. Now, for like lifters, if you go 1 hour in the gym, I think glycogen is not your main concern. It's maybe just for if you do, maybe if you do like a lot of long exercise sessions, etc., and especially for endurance athletes or some intermittent sports. But still, I think in terms of recovery, there's a lot still to investigate about heating in general. Mm-hmm. And something I would still love to do is just to figure out if we do local heating, so not with hot water immersion, but just very locally and try to make it as warm as possible, if we then see any benefit locally in the muscle. It's maybe not very a practical question to answer, but more like scientific, because I'm curious still about the heating in general. But yeah, there's a lot still to be answered about heating in general and sauna and also all these different strategies. So more will come. I'm actually working on a sauna study now, also for like longer term adaptations, not so much with exercise, but just general, see what the effects are. Mm-hmm. I don't have the data yet, unfortunately, so I cannot share anything. But I'm very curious what will come out of that and if sauna has some specific benefits or not for us in our muscle physiology.
Well, that'll be a good excuse for me to have you back on and discuss that then.
Yeah, happy to do that, yeah.
Cool. Well, I think that gives a very good overview on heating and cooling strategies. To me, it sounds like when it comes to heating, maybe a little bit more mixed results. Maybe there's quite a bit more work to do on like different ways of heating, going into a hot chamber versus locally heating and the different effects of that. So probably a bit more to kind of tease out there. But right now, if I could summarize or at least attempt to summarize things, I would say cooling for people focused on physique developments, probably not something someone wants to be doing all the time. And then for heating, it doesn't seem as though there are positive or negative effects of it at this point, but there's a lot more research to do. But if it helps you kind of relax in a wind down routine or can indirectly kind of decrease stress or something like that, it might have its applications. Does that sound about right?
I'm with you on that one.
Perfect. Well, if someone was listening to this and they're like, man, this guy knows his stuff, I need to find more about him, where could people find you online or keep in touch with your research and different stuff like that?
So I have Twitter. So on Twitter, especially if we have some new studies, I'll often post them there. Also sometimes on Instagram. It depends a little bit on, to be honest, I'm like on and off on like my social media. Every time when I'm a bit more busy, then that's the first thing to skip because my focus is still the research. But yeah, definitely if I have interesting work to share, that I will put that on my Twitter or my Instagram. That's mostly where I actually post my stuff then, yeah. And then, yeah, you can basically, I think at least you should be able to find it by typing in my name there. I think it's for my Instagram, it's just my name like attached to each other, so Cas Fuchs. And on Twitter it will be 27, so 27 and then CJ. Yeah, we also have a website of our research group in general, so that's also maybe interesting for people where we share like a lot of like work on like different things, like from plant-based proteins to study we did even on insect proteins. I recently did a study with my colleagues on the effects. We did the Rocky study. Maybe people find that also interesting to see if Rocky was right by ingesting raw eggs versus boiled eggs.
I think I came across that. This podcast was almost about that, actually.
We should have done it. I love to talk about that one too.
We'll have to get you on again, and we'll definitely cover that one.
So yeah, a lot. That is also that's like M3 Research Maastricht. So that's from our research group in Maastricht in the Netherlands, where we also share some stuff. So those are like some channels where you can find the research that I'm doing, and also my colleagues are working on.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It was nice to talk to you about it.